To rely on AHM to adjust season length and bag limit if the harvest rate increased. Because that's another thing a lot of hunters don't understand. They think that season length and bag limit takes care of maintenance of the duck population. But it doesn't. Because if every hunter killed a limit of ducks every day the season was open, we'd shoot all the ducks. The season length and bag limit are based on our experience with the harvest rate under those conditions. And so we set a bag limit of 6 ducks with a season length of 60 days, estimating that that's going to allow us to kill 12% of the adult male mallard population. And so obviously that doesn't mean the hunters kill a limit every single day of the season. And so the process is designed based on our experience. If something changes our experience, whatever that is, like right now, one of the things that's changing is the lower number of hunters. We've got fewer hunters, so our harvest rates are actually declining a little bit. We're only killing about 10% of the adult male population, even though our models tell us we should be taking 12. With a 60-day season with a 4 mallard limit or a 5 mallard limit in the central flyway. But it's all a modeling framework. So I'm gonna caution Mickey a little bit. When our 4 models, we have 4 models in AHM. Density dependent reproduction and additive mortality, density independent reproduction and additive mortality, and then density dependent and independent reproduction with compensatory mortality. That's our 4 models. And with those 4 models, we predict next year's breeding population. Well, we can see which one of those models is most successful at predicting next year's breeding population, and so that model gets more weight. Well, what's interesting is in a fairly short period of time, the models diverged. And about 70% of the weight is on additive mortality and weakly density dependent reproduction, and about 30% of the weight is on compensatory mortality with weak density dependent reproduction. And so what we're seeing in our modeling framework is that additive versus compensatory is more important than density dependent and non-density dependent, and most of the weight is on our additive models. But remember, this is a modeling framework, and you can have a model that successfully predicts a breeding population with everything else in the model being wrong. If you overestimate reproduction, so reproduction is actually less than what you're estimating, and you underestimate survival is actually higher than what it really is, you might nail the prediction, even though your estimates of survival and reproduction are bad. So be cautious when we say that mortality of mallards is mostly additive. Sure. It's mostly additive in the modeling framework, but all the other components of our model aren't necessarily correct.
And that's getting into the weeds of modeling.
It gets into the weeds, period, doesn't it?
Looking at the graph right here, and when the first 4 years or 5 years of this, there was very little difference in any
of the models.
Starting about in 1999, they really started to diverge, but they stayed fairly consistent until about 2010. And then following 2010 to the present, then this added weekly attendant is really taken off.
Really taken off.
In strength. Back to the decision, though, of not dealing with spinning wing decoys, it threw it back to the states. It really put the states in kind of an awkward situation to make that call, because they kind of wanted Big Brother to make the decision for them. At that time, certain states felt strongly enough about it, Minnesota being one of, which had that real cool study, because Minnesota understood that about 50% plus of the mallards that they shoot in the state of Minnesota do not come from the prairie pottle country. In fact, they're either locally raised or they're in the immediate Great Lakes region. So Minnesota was very concerned that if they used spinning wing decoys, they could disproportionately affect their own local population. So Minnesota made a decision to ban spinning wing decoys for at least a portion of the year. Likewise, state of Washington and the state of Oregon did the same, and also the state of California at one point had a ban on spinning wing decoys for the first half of the season, because a lot of mallards shot in California are locally raised for the same rationale or whatever. Arkansas, for a period of a couple of years, 3 years, decided not to use spinning wing decoys. So there was a movement. There was a movement by individual states to try and regulate this. But over time, it became probably more of a political issue for those states, because then the state residents, including the state of Arkansas, said, well, why are we being penalized? Because they're using them in Missouri, and they're still using them in Louisiana, and they're using them in Kentucky and Tennessee. Mm-hmm. Why are we being penalized that we can't use them in Arkansas? And so the pressure finally got to them, and they let them use them again. And the same thing kind of happened in some of the other states. So now we're back kind of at this point that there's very little regulation of them. And yet at the same time, this body of information, part of it coincidental, part of it relying on that old science, says, whoa, wait a minute, there's an awful lot of things that are stacking up here. We don't know. We have a lot of uncertainty, but like back to the Mississippi Flyway Council's recommendation, we're at this point again of raising that point of discussion, hopefully in a biologically, scientifically driven way, to ask the question of whether in fact the continued use of spinning wing decoys has had an effect on the distribution of at least certain population segments of mallards in particular. And I think that's where we're at today, is wanting to reopen that door, re-ask that question in a very formal, scientific manner, and not being afraid to ask that question. This is not going to make a lot of people happy, because for the last 20 years, we have a generation of duck hunters.
That's all they know.
That's all they've known.
That's all they know.
For 20 years, 24 years later, they've had 6 and 60 in the Mississippi Flyway. Since 1999, really 2001, 2002, they've been using spinning wing decoys. Every young hunter that's watching this, that's all you have ever known. So you're looking at it saying, you're going to take that away from me? You're not going to let me use that tool anymore? That's not right. But, young hunter, you have a fiduciary responsibility to this resource that you're a part of. You're a part of this fraternity. You're a part of this enterprise. If we're having an effect, if we are, we need to know it. We need to be not afraid to talk about it, and we need to deal with it if, in fact, it needs to be dealt with. So I guess I'll just kind of leave it at that I think it's a point of very deserving discussion in this whole mix of things. Mm-hmm. It's not just a silver bullet, no more than habitat or climate or anything else, but it's one of the component parts that if you want to start pointing fingers, it's probably a direction that some fingers need to be pointed at.
I would offer, along with that since then, Arkansas has now banned them on public ground, both federal and state.
Yes.
So that's happened. And again, this is more on the unscientific conjecture side, but just my observations were such that the 3-year time that they were banned, after we used them, and I have to be straight up, at first, in '99 when we had them, man, we was hooked on them things like Drughead is on crack cocaine, man. Them ones like you talked about had a little O-ring on it. I'd call my wife and anybody that was coming hunting with us to stop by Walmart and buy all the D-cell batteries you could buy just to keep it going.
We had battery pollution in the market.
And I'll agree with you that I think in the period of years from 1999 to about 01, 02, we super educated continental mouters. I think we really spurred that evolutionary process of hunter pressure making ducks smarter. Conjecture strictly on my part. But since then, man, we went for a while there. I wouldn't use them on the show, but I don't want to be a hypocrite either. Man, I killed a bunch of ducks over top of them. And traveling around the country, you'll go places and people got their spinners and you wind up using them, and we still do use them. That being said, those 3 years that it was first outlawed in Arkansas, I could tell that our hunting had got better. At least the way I hunt, the way I prefer to hunting public ground. And that first year we had them, the end of the 99-2000 duck season, I had a group of hunters in, and we were talking this same conversation that we always do. And a fellow by the name of Stan Goosey named it. He said, Jimbo, he said, we're messing up here. These ducks aren't acting right. You could start a bunch of ducks back then and finish them. You could keep that bunch together. By the end of that duck season, you'd start a good bunch of ducks, and you'd wind up, they'd start to come and they'd split and they'd go different directions, and you'd wind up shooting those sucker ducks that were flying around the spinner. And that, I think, spurred the process of that evolution. We're shooting the sucker ducks, and now we're not getting a whole bunch. We got rid of them for a while, ducks settled down. You could finish the big bunches. We was hunting Cache River bottoms. Mickey, if you remember them guys, we got some nice bunches of ducks in. No spinner, no jerk cord, and a duck call. So we got a lot of folks need to remember, one, what that looks like, and two, not going to break my heart to take it away. It's something else I don't have to mess with. But I think there's going to be a lot of pull and push from those people that manufacture them and those people that all they've ever known was hunting over a spinner.
And I'm not trying to take their livelihood away from them by any means. I'm just saying that me as a biologist, us as people concerned, other biologists, scientists, and so forth, that to me, what's different about this than looking at live decoys or looking at electronic collars or looking at bait or looking at, something else that is artificial, if you want to call it that, and I think it's deserving of discussion.
In my role as the Waterfowl Program Manager for the state of Louisiana, I have asked the question 3 times on large-scale waterfowl hunter surveys, starting in 2005, 2010, and again in 2012. And all 3 times I got the exact same answer. Over 60% of the hunters said, do not regulate spinning wing decoys.
And we live in an environment that most of us don't particularly like regulations that are overbearing. We like our freedom, we like our personal freedom. We live in the United States of America, and let it kind of self-regulate itself and all that. You are in a position, Larry, obviously, where you have a constituent base, as you said. You represent every single duck hunter in Louisiana.
Yep.
You do not just regulate duck.
And that's why we have to come at this from a scientific foundation.
When you sit in a duck blind hall, you're like a bunch of us did this last year, staring at the sky, and you can't help but think.
We needed something to talk about.
And then you look out there, and the only duck you see is doing. It's like, what about that thing?
Does your research and conclusion, do you think it's safe to say that spinning wing decoys is additive, or do we completely know that?
We don't know that, and I would say that probably in some respects in the north, there may be some total compensation.
Total compensation. Yeah.
With the young birds, because that young bird may have died anyway. But on the flip side, I would tend to think that the farther south you move in the flyway, and especially when you start increasing the differential vulnerability to adults, and especially adult females, then I would want to ask the question about additivity, and I personally believe that yes, there is additivity to that, at least for adult females, especially farther south in the flyway.
So potentially bird killed over spinning wing in decoy in Canada, no. One in Louisiana?
Yeah, but it's more than just the question about whether that duck killed by the spinning wing decoy proper is additive. We also now need to ask the question about the total harvest in the flyway because of more young ducks being shot in the north. That young duck that got shot in Saskatchewan for a spinning wing decoy might have died anyway, but it might not have died until it got down to Louisiana in the winter because it ran into disease or problems or whatever it may be. So back to this point of this real interesting dilemma that we see, that the number of young birds that are actually getting to the southern states proportionally, relatively, is going down over time because more of the young ones are being shot in the north, in part because of spinning wing decoys. What that starts to take us down the path of asking then, is if in fact these adults, there are more adults in the population in the south relatively than there were 20 years ago. So then when we kill a duck in Arkansas on the 28th of January, and it's a female mallard, an adult female mallard, because that's all that's there, because there's no young ones left anymore. Is that duck additive or is it compensatory? So there's an indirect effect to this business. It's not just whether the duck that was shot by a spinning wing decoy, but by the fact that it was shot and no longer is in the population, and then does that have an effect on the remaining portions of the population over time? Does that have an effect? And that'll take us down another discussion.
And as you talk about migration timing, overwinter migration, at some point in time, the Canada goose quit wintering in heavy numbers in southern Illinois and north Missouri, the Sumner, Missouri area. Where is it that we see that same thing happening again? I know all ducks are important. I'm a mallard guy, but at which point in time does that start to look like the same thing that happened with the Canada goose that now may be happening with mallard ducks?
But for geese in particular, the Canada goose story is pretty well known and pretty well understood. That populations of Canada geese that historically moved all the way down into coastal Louisiana gradually started not going to Louisiana. Birds in Arkansas started to decline. More Canada geese started staying in southern Illinois or western Kentucky or Swan Lake, Missouri, and the population gradually shifted so that Louisiana didn't have any geese anymore, if any, and Missouri had a whole bunch of them. To be honest, that's where this term short-stopping started to originate. Now that eastern prairie population of Canada geese doesn't even come to Missouri. Very few of them, except in real extreme conditions. So now they're wintering in Minnesota, and the southern Illinois flock is wintering in northern Illinois or Chicago suburbs or whatever. The history of waterfowl management is rich from the Canada goose story. The Atlantic flyway population of Canada geese, the Mississippi Valley population, the Tennessee Valley population, the eastern prairie population, the Great Basin population. There's just almost all the Canada geese, the interior group in particular, and even some of the small ones have shifted north. White fronts, we already started talking about. There's an increasing body of information showing white fronts gradually drifting farther north from a population proportional aspect. And Paul, you can comment on that if you'd like to. So white geese, less information, but honestly a few little hints of things starting to go on with white geese.